Okie dokie, so I'm going to be making a MarcEdit update available today, at the end of today. It's going to include updates for the Windows version, and for the Mac version, and for the Linux version, which will be a big update for the Linux version because I haven't updated that specific version for a while, given that there are so few people who use it. They will be kind of graduated updates in terms of what each one's going to include. For the Windows version, it'll include the watcher functionality. It's finished. So you'll see mine's running down here, so you can set up your service. The last part that was kind of vexing me was figuring out how to get that watcher to turn off when I was updating the program. It works now probably at about 98% of the time, where the watcher will recognize that a new version of MarcEdit is trying to be installed and will automatically shut itself down. If that doesn't happen, you just have to shut it down for the watcher. Anyways, the big change, though, that will be available in all versions is a change in the way that the program reads data files. And this goes back to something I've been working on for a while. So inside of MarcEdit, just to explain kind of what's going on here, let me see if this is the one. Here we go. I'm going to impress you all with some terrible drawing. So inside of MarcEdit, the way that the program works is, because MarcEdit works with really large batch files, it can't read and display the entire file on the screen. And there's a reason for that. MarcEdit works with really large files, and when you deal with really large files, graphical interfaces, particularly like Windows, do not like loading data sets that are hundreds of megabytes in size. It's a rough equivalent, but I figure based on benchmarking and the way that bits and bytes memory work, if you take a file, let's say a megabyte file, and you render that entire megabyte into a graphical interface, you can usually assume that the size of the file times 8 works out to roughly about the amount of virtual memory needed to load the file. And this is what ends up being a problem. When you have really large data files, there's just not enough virtual memory in order for the operating system to open it. And it actually gets worse in the Linux and the Mac environment. So the way that MarcEdit has dealt with this historically is it creates pages. And pages are kind of an interesting thing. The way that I kind of worked out how paging works is kind of described poorly in this diagram here. You have a file, it gets pressed into an algorithm that creates a reader. That reader is looking for new lines. And basically this is why the reader exists. In order for MarcEdit to understand how many records per page, it uses those new lines to determine where records start and stop. Now the challenge with new lines is that there are lots of them. Windows uses most Windows programs use a 2-character byte sequence to represent new lines, at least traditionally. Some newer Windows applications will utilize the more Linux-friendly single new line character, and even some applications, and I'm seeing this show up in Marc Records, will utilize a new Unicode value, which is a high value, which is multi-byte, that represents a new line. This is really problematic. Because the tool, when it creates that algorithm, is reading data by bytes. And so what happens is a lot of processing happens. In order for that processing to happen, you have to think of a file as essentially a stream of bits, in the way that MarcEdit's reading this file. And in order for it to understand where the new lines are, it's constantly having to read forward and backwards, and forwards and backwards. And so that ends up taking time. Because it can't see a new line character the first time and assume that character is the same the rest of the way through the file, because I run into a lot of files where people have edited a record set and then they've edited it again in a script. So like a Perl script or a Python script. Well, Perl and Python don't use, even on Windows, the 2-byte equivalents. They stick with a single new line or maybe a carriage return. And that's really problematic. So the new lines become issues. And so what MarcEdit does, it reads and processes this data file. It's constantly during that process file, doing it very quickly, going forward and backwards, a lot of caching involved. And what that does is it creates from your file a data map. So it creates a map of bytes. And each one of the pages in MarcEdit is a start and an end of those bytes. And it's all because of new lines. Now, the problem I've been trying to solve here has been related to when users use workflows that that have MarcEdit edit data manually. So they're editing the pages manually, jumping to new pages, and then we'll do a new global operation, whether that operation is checking the like a field count, or doing another replace, or adding a field. The way the tool was set up, the best practice has always been, after you finish your manual edits, save the file, because MarcEdit needs to repage the file, because you've made changes and there's no way of knowing if the number, because it has an exact number of bytes, there's no way to know that you've replaced the exact number of bytes. And if you don't do that, then what happens is that sometimes file reading doesn't happen the way you think it should. Fortunately, this is a workflow that doesn't happen as often within the application, but it's one that I've been trying to solve. And so this process here doesn't work well within the way that to fix that process, because it takes too long to reprocess the file. Just creating a virtual map of bytes just is problematic. And I'm going to show you what I mean. So I have downloaded a file from the Harvard's Open Data Set. And so I took one of the files. So it's roughly about 1 gigabyte. And MarcEdit now, you'll notice, I'm going to show you this, I've added a new option in the editor. By default, it's going to be turned off, but I'm going to leave this on. It's enable legacy paging. So I've been doing a lot of work on setting up how MarcEdit creates pages and saves, and I set this legacy byte just in case I missed something, so you can go back to the way it worked before. So this is the record set. It's roughly under 1 million records, but it's over 1 million. It's about 1 gigabyte in size. So I'm going to go ahead and load this using the old process. And so it's going to work there for a little while, and we're going to move on to the way that I'm addressing this now. So another poorly drawn thing. All right. So in the new process, the way that I needed to get away from reading the back and forth. The back and forth in the byte stream, even though it happens relatively quickly, is too much file reading. And so the process that I've set up now is inside MarcEdit. There's a very custom abstract class, which is my watcher class. Basically, its entire job is to basically just take a file and turn it into a stack of lines. It creates an enumeration. It's kind of like a lambda expression. And so you pass the file into this watcher. The watcher actually, its only job is to understand what new lines are and kick out lines for the reader. So the reader actually doesn't know where it starts and stops. So you'll see it took 56 seconds to create all the pages and to load the file for you to work with in the old file reading method. Now, the interesting thing about the old file reading method is you make trade-offs. So the trade-off I made here is, because I now know where the bytes are, I can move between pages very quickly without having to readdress the file. The problem is the file changes. If you've made changes globally and you haven't repaged the count, done the repage count, you'll likely lose manual changes made between sessions, and that's been the issue I've been trying to work with. So I'm going to close that and I'll come back to it in a minute. So the way the watcher works is it creates a stack of lines. Now the reason why it does this is in order to move away from bytes where I have to go back and forth to understand new lines. If I can address this problem up front, then the process only has to read one way. And if it only has to read one way, and the process doesn't have to wait for things to happen, and I can cache way ahead of the way of the processing that's actually happening, I can essentially make the process as fast as the hard drive can give the application data. So again, we create a virtual map, but now the virtual map isn't a map of bytes, it's a map of lines. So there's a start and an end, but instead of start and end of byte numbers, so like 0 byte to say 999 byte, it's lines, 0 line to line number something. And there's no processing involved. The program just basically passes data out because it doesn't care anymore about end of lines. The watcher takes care of all of that. And what that does is that makes things happen very quickly, and it means that I can shift the way that I think about how data gets saved. So before, the program only repaged itself when the file reloaded into the editor. But because this process happens so quickly, and by quickly I mean really quickly, you can actually set repaging to happen after operations where normally I wouldn't want to do it because it would take some time. So if you think about when I just loaded that gigabyte file, it took 56 seconds-ish to load that gigabyte file. That would be something you wouldn't want to wait for if you were doing a bunch of manual edits. Then you do a refind, and that process has to repage, and it should, so that you make sure you get all of the changes made. Then that's 56 seconds you have to wait just for the program to do the save and repage so that it can do the find operation. That's not good. But it's really the only solution to solve the workflow issue. So let me go back in here. I'm going to turn the legacy page off and restart the program. Now what this does is it tells the program to go ahead and use this new approach. And so we'll go ahead and grab that file again and load it. And in this case, where the old file took, 56 seconds to load, this one will end up taking 11 seconds. And it actually is faster if I'm not recording the screen. It usually takes about 7 seconds, but the screen recording is going to take a hit. So we've been able to speed the process up significantly. So one of the things I found is that this works really well in expanded solutions. So I took the entire open data set, 12 gigabytes of data. In the previous loading method, that process takes roughly about, let's say, 100 seconds per gigabyte. So that would be about 1,200 seconds to load the entire Harvard database into the MarcEditor where paging has to happen. In the current method, it takes roughly about 100 seconds, so less than a minute, or a little over a minute and a half to load the entire 12 gigabyte data. So the watcher process works a lot better, and this means that saving happens differently. So in the old way the program worked, there was a lot of reading back and forth again because the tool had to be able to be very particular, knowing when a page has been edited and when a page has been changed. That doesn't happen anymore. It goes back into the abstract class. The abstract class just reads very quickly through the entire file, replacing the lines that have been changed through the process. And I've been testing this quite a bit over the past month. The process seems to be pretty rock solid. I haven't been able to cause any issues, but this is why I'm leaving the legacy part in, because the last time I made significant changes to the file editor, the way it read and write, I made a small mistake, and that caused some issues in specific workflows. I don't think that's going to happen again because like I said, I've been spending a lot of time kind of working through this process to make sure that things really didn't change. And the other thing I'm hoping happens is that the file reading becomes more resilient. One of the reasons why I went about doing this change is that in the process now, very small formatting issues can have significant issues in the way that the program reads the application, reads the file, because it's looking specifically for the MarcEdit mnemonic format. If the format's not right, it can cause some issues. That should not be the case anymore because the program really doesn't care anymore about how the line is structured. It had to care before. It does not care now. It just reads a line and kicks it out. There's no processing that happens. That means it can happen very, very quickly. So hopefully that helps to explain a little bit of why the program worked the way it did, and will make this process work a little bit better, hopefully. So I'm anticipating that this will make some workflow changes for folks in terms of being able to process the data faster. Like I said, the new elements that you will find, this will be off by default. There is an option here to enable the legacy paging, which will turn the paging back on to the way MarcEdit works right now as of this moment. And then by default it'll be turned off, so it'll go to the new paging mode. The other benefit of the new paging mode, just as an FYI, I notice sometimes when .NET gets crazy and needs to be repaired, the part that breaks first is the way that MarcEdit reads files for paging. And the reason for that is because MarcEdit reads at a binary level, it's reading pointers. It's not actually reading data. It's reading a data stream, and this data stream exists just in memory. And so the data is actually addressing memory points. And I find that when .NET sometimes needs to be repaired, being able to read those pointers becomes problematic. That's actually how I usually know that people need to repair the program, because that one piece will get kind of funky. So this will presumably solve that as well. The other change that'll happen because of this is inside of MarcEdit there is a piece of program that basically reads the size of the file, and if the file is over, I think it's 100 megabytes, it asks you if you want to load the file into preview mode. If you are using the legacy paging, that size will stay in effect. If you're using the new paging mode, I'm going to bump that up probably to about 1 gigabyte, because I'm finding that the 7 to 8 seconds it takes for me to load 1 gigabyte of data is definitely okay. Like I said, there are some trade-offs. The big trade-off that happens in the new paging process is that when changing between pages, the process is not as fast as the old process, because the old process had exact bytes and I could read those bytes directly off the file. The process now uses a lambda expression to extract lines. If you're using a gigabyte file and you're jumping to the end of the file is going to take a little longer than the beginning of the file, but again, the process happens so quickly, it shouldn't be a significant change. But instead of the process maybe loading within 1.5 seconds, it may take 2 in order to process. Again, trade-offs that happen during each process. I feel like the trade-off in this case is probably better than before, simply because you're getting a much better experience, and the process has changed so significantly in terms of how much faster everything is running. So today I'm going through and I'm making last-minute adjustments. I'm putting together the change list. I'll be rebuilding the Mac version. The Mac version will include these changes in the reading and writing. The thing that the Mac version doesn't have, because I haven't quite figured out how to make it work in terms of a service, because Mac services are different, is the Watcher service. There is a Watcher tool though that I'm turning on that you can enable, but it's something that you're having to actually enable, because I haven't been able to figure out how to create a service that boots on startup. I'm hoping by the second update, I'll be updating again on the first of the year, that I'll have some of that other stuff done. In the Windows version, it'll probably be a very small update. In the Mac version, hopefully it'll be a more significant one. So that's the work that's been done, and hopefully that explains some of the changes that are being made in the reader.